May 11th, 1996. A man lies motionless in the snow on Mount Everest. His face is completely black with frostbite. His hands are frozen solid. 2 different rescue teams have already found him and checked his pulse, and both times they came to the same conclusion: this guy's dead. They even informed his wife that his body was going to stay up there forever, but hours later, something will happen that defies every principle of high-altitude medicine, something that no doctor, no climber, and no scientist will ever be able to explain. This is the incredible story of Beck Weathers. Welcome to the Extreme Edge. If you had looked at the base camp of Mount Everest just after midnight on May 10th, 1996, you would have seen something that would make any experienced mountaineer incredibly uneasy. About 30 climbers from different expeditions were all gearing up to attempt the summit on the same exact day. On Everest, even one delay can end a life. There are sections that can only be climbed by one person at a time, like the Hillary Step, a 40-foot wall of rock and ice at 28,700 feet. 30 people trying to get through these bottlenecks means a traffic jam on the highest mountain in the world. And up here, above 26,000 feet, standing still means dying slower. At those heights, there's only about 1/3 of the oxygen that exists at sea level. Your body literally cannot sustain life up there. Even with supplemental oxygen, your heart hammers at 140 beats per minute just to keep you conscious. Your blood thickens. Your brain starts shutting down. Most people can't survive more than 16 to 20 hours in the death zone. But the real issue that night wasn't the crowds, it was the weather. Reports had been coming in for days about a massive storm system developing, set to peak on Everest on May 11th. The climbers had one job: get up fast and get down fast before that storm hit. Among those 30 climbers was Beck Weathers, a 49-year-old pathologist from Dallas, Texas. He was fit, experienced, and had been working toward this moment for years. He was attempting the 7 Summits challenge of climbing the highest peak on each continent, and Everest was going to be his crowning achievement. But what Beck didn't know was that 18 months earlier, he'd done something routine that was about to put him in a position no human being should ever survive in the next few hours. But we'll get to that in a minute. Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you'd like to be part of the extreme community, get early access to our videos and exclusive polls, come join us on Patreon. See you there. Beck was a client on Rob Hall's Adventure Consultants team. Rob Hall was a legendary guide from New Zealand who had summited Everest 5 times. If you were going to trust your life to anyone on that mountain, Rob Hall was the guy. The team also included a postal worker named Doug Hansen, who was trying for his 2nd time after failing the year before, a Japanese businesswoman named Yasuko Namba, and a journalist named John Krakauer. So just after midnight on May 10th, Beck and about 30 other climbers started their final push toward the summit, and at first, everything seemed fine. Conditions were tough, but manageable, exactly as they'd expected. Rob, the lead climber, had them on a good pace. The plan was simple: reach the summit quickly by early afternoon, then get back down to Camp 4 before dark. But as they climbed higher through the darkness, Beck started noticing something weird. His vision was getting blurry. Not terrible at first, just a little off. He figured maybe it was the cold or the altitude, so he kept climbing. But as they went higher, it got worse. By the time they reached about 27,000 feet, Beck realized he couldn't see clearly anymore. Shapes were fuzzy, distances were hard to judge. Then they hit their first major problem. At the balcony at 27,400 feet, the fixed ropes that were supposed to help climbers navigate weren't there. The Sherpas hadn't set them up yet. Everyone had to stop and wait while the guides scrambled to fix it. Nearly an hour of precious time they didn't have. During that wait, as dawn started creeping over the Himalayas, Beck realized something terrifying. He wasn't just blurry anymore, he could barely see at all. He was going blind. Beck immediately told Rob Hall. Rob understood the severity. You cannot climb Everest blind. One wrong step and you're falling thousands of feet to your death. So, Rob made a call. He told Beck to sit down right there at the balcony and wait. Maybe when the sun came up fully, Beck's vision might improve. "Just wait here for me," Rob said. "When I come back down from the summit, we'll descend together." Beck agreed. What else could he do? So he sat down at 27,400 feet to wait, and he would end up sitting there for over 10 hours while everything fell apart around him. Here's what caused Beck's vision problem. 18 months earlier, Beck had gotten an eye surgery procedure called a radial keratotomy to fix his nearsightedness. The surgeon makes tiny incisions in your cornea in a spoke-like pattern. The cuts flatten the cornea and correct your vision. Beck's surgery went perfectly. What virtually nobody knew back in 1994 was that radial keratotomy creates permanent weak spots in your cornea. When the eye isn't getting enough oxygen, those weak spots swell, causing the cornea to flatten even more than intended. Your perfect sea-level vision suddenly becomes severely distorted. So while Beck went to Everest thinking his vision problems were solved forever, what he actually did was he carried a hidden medical danger that activated at the worst possible moment in the worst possible place. And now, Beck was sitting at the balcony, blind, waiting for Rob Hall to come back and guide him down. But Rob Hall had his own problems developing up above. See, Rob and the rest of the team had hit another massive bottleneck at the Hillary Step. Again, the fixed ropes hadn't been set up yet. More delays, more oxygen burned, more precious time lost. At this point, Rob started feeling antsy. They were already way behind schedule before this happened, and there's this really important rule on Everest: turn around by 2 p.m., no matter what. Because if you're still up there in the death zone when darkness falls, you're probably going to die. But here was the brutal reality. These clients had paid $65,000 each. Some had mortgaged their houses for this. This was their dream. And Rob knew that if he turned them around now, just an hour from the summit, they would be devastated. So, Rob made a decision that would haunt the climbing world for decades. He let them continue. By the time the first climbers reached the top, it was 1 p.m., then more at 2 p.m., then 3 p.m. The last climber, Doug Hansen, reached the summit around 4 p.m., and Rob stayed up there with him the entire time, making sure his client achieved his dream, because that was the kind of guy Rob Hall was. And while that sentiment is truly admirable, it would come back to haunt Rob in the worst possible way. Because throughout that day, as climbers celebrated at the summit, something was happening that nobody could see yet. Around 3 p.m., snow started falling. Light flurries at first. By 4 p.m., heavier. By 5 p.m., the wind picked up. And then, at 6 p.m., everything changed. The wind went from a breeze to a freight train in seconds. Suddenly, it was hitting 70 miles per hour, gusting over 100. Near hurricane-force winds, in a place where the human body is already operating at the absolute edge of survival. Even worse, the visibility disappeared. One moment you could see the person in front of you, the next moment, nothing. Just white everywhere. Climbers described it as being trapped inside a bottle of milk. Remember the storm I told you about earlier, predicted to hit on May 11th? Well, it came a full day earlier than anyone had expected, just as the climbers were descending Everest. Rob knew they were in serious trouble. Now he had exhausted clients scattered across the upper mountain, with a blizzard closing in and darkness hours away. Even worse, Doug Hansen had completely run out of energy. His legs wouldn't work anymore. His supplemental oxygen had run out, and without it, his body was shutting down fast. Rob tried everything to get Doug moving, but Doug couldn't do it, and Rob refused to leave him. So while other climbers were desperately trying to descend, Rob stayed with Doug near the south summit, hoping against hope that Doug would somehow find the strength to move. Meanwhile, down at the balcony, Beck Weathers had been sitting there completely alone, blind for over 10 hours now, waiting for Rob to come back like he'd promised. He had no idea that Rob was trapped way above him or that the storm had hit early. And sitting there in the cold, Beck started having this strange sensation. He felt warm, comfortable even, like he was back home in his bed in Dallas with Texas sunlight streaming through the window. What Beck didn't realize was that the warmth he was feeling was hypothermia setting in. His core body temperature was dropping so low that his brain was starting to shut down. He was freezing to death, but his dying brain was telling him he felt warm and safe. It's very possible Beck could have passed away right there, and we wouldn't be telling this story. But just then, A guy named Mike Groom appeared out of the whiteout with a ragtag group of about 10 climbers. These weren't all from the same expedition. The storm had caught everyone off guard, and now climbers from different teams were banding together just trying to survive. Mike Groom's clients, Rob's clients, people who'd never met each other before that day, all stumbling down together through the blizzard. When Mike found Beck sitting there alone, barely conscious, he knew Beck couldn't stay there. So he helped Beck to his feet and got him moving with the group. But remember, Beck had been sitting motionless at 27,400 feet for 10 hours. His body was barely functioning. He was severely hypothermic, oxygen deprived, and completely blind. The group started moving down together, with Beck stumbling along, but in that whiteout, nobody could actually see where they were going. The wind was screaming at over 70 miles per hour. They walked for what felt like hours. They should have reached Camp 4 by now, but there was nothing, just endless white in every direction. They quickly realized something terrifying. They were completely lost. Somewhere on the South Col, in hurricane-force winds, in the death zone, with their oxygen running out, they had made a wrong turn, and now they had no idea where they were. Finally, they just couldn't go any further. One by one, the climbers collapsed from exhaustion. They huddled together in the snow, trying to preserve whatever body heat they had left, and that's where Beck Weathers collapsed too. Later, they would find out they'd been wandering in circles. They were only roughly 65 feet from a massive cliff edge called the Kangshung Face. If they'd walked just a little bit further in that direction, they would have walked straight off the mountain. But they didn't know that yet. All they knew was they couldn't move anymore. They were done. But around midnight, there was a brief moment where the storm cleared just enough that they could see lights in the distance. Camp 4, maybe 500 feet away, less than the length of 2 football fields. So close, but in their condition, it might as well have been on another planet. Some of the stronger climbers decided to make a run for it. They got up and stumbled toward those lights, and somehow they made it. When they reached Camp 4, they immediately told the others about the people left behind in the storm. That's when a Russian guy named Anatoly Bukriv did something absolutely incredible. This guy had already summited Everest earlier that day without supplemental oxygen, then descended back to Camp 4. He was exhausted, but when he heard there were people dying out there, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his headlamp and went back out into that blizzard at 26,000 feet in complete darkness. Bukriv made multiple trips into the storm that night. Each time he'd venture out into the whiteout, somehow find someone, and drag them back to camp. He saved 3 people that night through sheer willpower and courage. But when Bukriv saw Beck, he had to make a tough decision. At this point, Beck was lying there with his face encrusted in ice, completely black with frostbite. His jacket was somehow open and packed with snow. His right glove was gone, and his bare hand was already turning gray and hard like frozen meat. And his right arm had frozen in this grotesque position above his head that he couldn't lower. Bukriv checked for a pulse. It was there, but barely. So faint he could hardly detect it. Now, I want you to imagine you are Anatoly Bukriv right now. You're standing at 26,000 feet in the death zone. You've already climbed Everest today without oxygen. You've made multiple rescue trips into a blizzard that's trying to kill you. You're exhausted, your body is breaking down, and now you're looking at 2 people who appear to be dying or already dead. You know that if you try to move them, it might kill you too. And if you die, you can't save anyone else. What do? Bukriv made the only call he could. He left them there and went back to save the people who still had a fighting chance. And just like that, Beck Weathers was left for dead for the first time. But the story doesn't end there. The next morning, around 6 a.m. on May 11th, a Canadian doctor named Stuart Hutchinson woke up at Camp 4 with a thought that wouldn't leave him alone. Now, Stuart was one of Rob Hall's clients who had turned back before reaching the summit the day before. Unlike the others, he made the tough call when he realized the delays were too dangerous and headed back. Now, while most of the survivors at camp were too exhausted or too traumatized to move, Stuart couldn't stop thinking about the people who'd been left out there in the storm. So Stuart grabbed a couple of Sherpas and went back out to check. Maybe, just maybe, someone was still alive. When they reached the location where Beck had been left, he was completely buried in snow. Only his hands and feet were visible, sticking out. Stewart and the Sherpas started chipping away the ice from his face, and when they finally cleared it, Stewart checked for a pulse. It was there. Barely, but it was there. But Beck's condition was catastrophic. His face was completely black with frostbite, with ice everywhere, and his right arm was already dead. Stuart Hutchison later said that Beck Weathers was as close to death and still breathing as any patient he had ever seen in his entire medical career. He could barely detect Beck's carotid pulse, which is the last pulse you lose before you die. By every medical standard Stuart knew, Beck Weathers was gone. His body just hadn't stopped yet. So Stuart made the only call he could make. He left Beck there and returned to Camp 4 to report his findings. Beck Weathers was officially declared dead for the second time. At 6 a.m. on May 11, 1996, Peach Weathers got a phone call at her home in Dallas. It was from Adventure Consultants in New Zealand. They told her that her husband had passed away on Mount Everest. They said Beck had been lying in negative 40-degree Fahrenheit temperatures for approximately 18 hours, that he had been unconscious in a hypothermic coma for 15 hours. Every principle of high-altitude medicine said this man should be dead. Everyone who had examined him believed he was dead. And yet, at 4 p.m. that afternoon, Beck Weathers opened his eyes. At first, he was really confused. He said later that his first sensation was warmth and comfort. He genuinely thought he was in his bed at home in Dallas, with Texas sunlight coming through the window. But then something happened that Beck couldn't really explain, even years later. His family appeared in his mind's eye. Not like a memory or a photograph. He said they appeared in vivid focus, as if they might speak to him at any moment. His wife, Peach, his daughter, Meg, his son, Bub, and Beck understood something with perfect clarity. He said later it was like hearing a voice that told him, if you don't get up right now, you will never see them again. Now here's what makes this moment so incredibly profound. Beck Weathers had been running from his family for years. You see, Beck had been dealing with severe, life-threatening depression since college. For over 20 years, this thing he called the Black Dog had been eating him alive every single day. He never told anyone about it. In his mid-30s, Beck accidentally discovered that if he drove his body hard enough through extreme physical punishment, the depression would actually lift for a while. That lack of thinking, that mental silence, was the most pleasant thing he'd ever experienced. So at 40 years old, Beck got into mountaineering, and the mountains became his escape from the depression. High-altitude climbing gave him complete silence in his head through brutal physical exhaustion. But eventually, the mountains stopped being an escape and became an obsession. His training schedule was absolutely insane. He'd wake up at 4 a.m. to work out, then spend the whole day at the hospital as a pathologist, come home, barely say 2 words to his family, and pass out at 8 p.m. Then, he'd disappear for weeks at a time on expeditions. His daughter Meg said he'd work out all day and I'd never see him. Then he'd go climb these mountains for weeks at a time. It was really hard on me because I just missed my dad and wished he were here. His son was even more direct. I never really noticed when he was gone because he was absent when he was here. By the spring of 1996, Beck's 20-year marriage had reached a breaking point. Peach had decided to divorce him. She'd made this decision while Beck was preparing for his Everest trip. But she wasn't going to tell him while he was on the mountain. She was going to wait until he got back. So Beck left for Everest in May 1996, having no idea that when he came home, his marriage was finished. This guy who had spent 2 decades running from his family, who had pushed them so far away that his wife was planning to leave him and his kids barely knew him, was now lying there, dying on Everest. And what happens in his mind as he's on the edge of death? Not his career achievements, not the mountains he'd conquered, the faces of the family he'd been running from. And that vision saved Beck Weathers' life. He said later, I am neither churchly nor a particularly spiritual person, but I can tell you that some force within me rejected death at the last moment. Beck started checking his body. He tried to move his right hand when he banged it against the ice, and it made that hollow, wooden sound. And that noise brought him back to reality with a crash. This was not a bed. This was not a dream. This was real. At that moment, Beck Weathers decided that he wanted to live. Now, Beck's physical condition when he regained consciousness should have made any kind of movement completely impossible. He was blind in one eye. In the other eye, he could see maybe 1 to 3 feet maximum. His right hand was useless. His left hand was severely frostbitten. His entire body was numb from hypothermia. He was disoriented and confused from the altitude. He hadn't eaten or drank water for hours. His supplemental oxygen was completely depleted. Camp 4 was approximately 300 yards away. That's less than a quarter of a mile. In normal conditions at sea level, that's maybe a 2-minute walk. But at 26,000 feet, severely frostbitten, hypothermic, and essentially blind, that distance might as well have been 300 miles. Beck Weathers got up anyway. He said later, "I figured I had 3 or 4 hours left to live, so I started walking." He used what little vision remained in one eye. He relied on his memory of where the camp had been located. He stumbled constantly. He fell. He got up. He fell again. He had no depth perception, so he couldn't judge where the ground was. His feet felt like porcelain, like they were going to shatter with every step. But Beck Weathers had spent decades training his body to endure punishment. He'd spent years punishing himself to the absolute limit to escape his depression, and he used that discipline now. He said, "As long as my legs would run and I could stand up, I was going to move toward that camp. If I fell down, I was going to get up. And if I fell down again, I was going to get up, and I was going to keep moving until I either hit that camp, I couldn't get up at all, or I walked off the face of that mountain." The journey probably took him somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes. 30 to 60 minutes of falling, rising, and stumbling forward through the most hostile environment on the entire planet. But he made it. At approximately 4:35 p.m. on May 11th, Beck Weathers stumbled into Camp 4, to the pure shock and disbelief of every single climber on that mountain. Todd Burleson, an American climber who was there, later described what he saw. "I couldn't believe what I saw. This man had no face. It was completely black, solid black, like he had a crust over him. His jacket was unzipped down to his waist, full of snow. His right arm was bare and frozen over his head. He could not lower it. His skin looked like marble, white stone, no blood in it." Think about that for a second. These were climbers who had been told Beck Weathers was dead. Some of them had literally helped make the phone call to Peach Weathers, informing her that her husband had died on the mountain. They had written him off and made their peace with his death. Now, here he was, walking into camp under his own power. But here's the thing. Despite this absolutely miraculous return, the grim medical assessment remained unchanged. Nobody thought Beck Weathers was going to survive the night. They put him in a tent, gave him sleeping bags and hot water bottles and a steroid injection, and then they basically left him to die as comfortably as possible. But Beck, even in his condition, maintained his sense of humor. When climbers first reached him, he joked, "They told me this trip was going to cost me an arm and a leg. So far, I've gotten a little better deal." Beck survived another night, and the next morning, May 12th, when the survivors were preparing to evacuate, they found Beck Weathers still alive, still coherent, to everyone's continued surprise. But getting Beck off the mountain alive was going to require something that had literally never been done before in mountaineering history. You see, while Beck was clinging to life on the mountain, his wife Peach was orchestrating what can only be described as a miracle back in Dallas. After receiving the phone call that Beck was dead, and then hearing hours later that he was somehow alive but unreachable, Peach went into overdrive. She contacted U.S. Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison. She reached out to Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle. She got the State Department involved, who contacted the U.S. Embassy in Kathmandu. But here was the problem. What Peach was asking for was impossible. Literally impossible. Beck needed to be evacuated by helicopter from approximately 19,860 feet, and helicopters simply cannot fly at that altitude. The air is so thin that they can't generate enough lift to stay airborne. Multiple experienced civilian helicopter pilots had already refused the mission. They said it couldn't be done. But on May 13th, 1996, embassy officials tracked down a pilot at the Royal Nepal Golf Club. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Madan Khatri Chetri. He was a member of the warrior caste of Nepal, a designation that carries significant cultural weight and demands a personal code of honor. When the embassy officials explained the situation and essentially challenged him to prove his brave heart, Madan Khatri Chetri's response was immediate. He said, "I will do this thing. I will rescue the Beck." What happened next sounds literally like something straight out of Mission Impossible. Madan stripped the helicopter of all unnecessary equipment to reduce weight. He flew solo with no co-pilot and no crew. He carried only minutes of spare fuel. He flew just feet off the ground wherever possible to maximize air density under the rotors. And then he pushed that helicopter beyond its recommended limits, flying in severe snowstorm conditions with winds gusting between 20 and 70 miles per hour and temperatures at -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Climbers at Camp 1 scrambled to clear a flat landing zone. They marked an X in the snow with Kool-Aid powder because that's all they had. Madon circled multiple times, assessing whether landing was even possible. And then he brought the helicopter down. The first passenger was Makalu Gao, a Taiwanese climber who was also in critical condition. Beck, despite being in desperate condition himself, gave up his spot. He said later, "It seemed like the thing to do at the time, but when that helicopter took off with Makalu in it, I must tell you, my spirits were down around my feet because I didn't think he was coming back." But Madan Khatri Chetri did come back. He landed a second time at nearly 20,000 feet. Beck Weathers was gently lifted aboard, and the helicopter descended to Everest Base Camp, then continued to Kathmandu. The rescue set the record for the highest helicopter landing and rescue ever completed. For his incredible heroism, Madan Khatri Chetri was awarded the Nepal Tara Star of Nepal, Nepal's highest military honor. But at the hospital in Dallas, Beck faced the brutal medical consequences of his survival. The frostbite damage required nearly a dozen surgeries over the next year. His right arm was amputated halfway between his elbow and wrist. All 4 fingers and his thumb on his left hand had to be amputated. The surgeons fashioned what remained into a functional mitt. Parts of both feet required amputation. The surgeons even had to rebuild Beck's nose. The tissue had died completely, leaving a gaping hole in his face. They harvested skin and tissue from his forehead and rotated it down to reconstruct his nose. Beck literally had his new nose growing on his forehead for months while the tissue established new blood vessels. But Beck survived. He even returned to work as a pathologist about 4 months after his amputations, working with a physician's assistant who provided the fine motor skills his missing fingers could no longer perform. And here's the most remarkable thing. The chronic, life-threatening depression, that black dog that had stalked Beck for over 20 years, simply vanished. It was just gone. Beck explained it like this: "The things that made me miserable and driven have largely disappeared. I got that monkey off my back, and I'm a vastly happier person and much more at peace than I have ever been in my life." Beck decided at that moment that he would dedicate all his obsession, all his drive, all his determination to becoming the man his family deserved. And the transformation was real and profound. By 2015, nearly 20 years after Everest, Beck and Peach were still together in their North Dallas home. Beck had become a grandfather who doted on his grandchildren. His grown children lived nearby. The marriage that was heading for divorce in 1996 hadn't just survived, it had thrived. So that's the story of Beck Weathers, a man who spent decades running from his family, using mountains to escape his depression, a man who was declared dead twice on the highest mountain in the world, a man who lost his hands, his nose, and parts of his feet, and gained peace, connection, and the understanding that what he needed had always been waiting at home. These are the things that remind me of the incredible capacity humans have for both survival and transformation. Not just surviving impossible odds, but becoming better people because of what we've endured. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.